Will Russia invade Ukraine? In Kyiv, Ukrainians hold a unity march in February in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin's threats to invade. Putin has created a trap for himself, according to University of Rochester political science professor and Russia expert Randall Stone. Getty Images photo/Chris McGrath, Rochester's Russia expert Randall Stone explains why an invasion would be a terrible miscalculation. Russian President Vladimir Putin's recent belligerent behavior toward neighboring Ukraine has already caused NATO allies to close ranks and work in much greater unity, says Randall Stone, a political science professor and the chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Rochester. Putin calculated that if he bluffed, the West would fold. Now he is stuck with a bet that he cannot cover, and he has to decide whether to cut his losses or escalate, Stone says. University of Rochester photo/J. Adam Fenster. Now, Putin has created a trap for himself and is ending up in a weaker position, according to Stone, who is also the director of the university's Skalny Center for Polish and Central European Studies. An expert on Russia and U.S.-Russian relations, Stone notes that the current situation feels like Back to the Future, 31 years after Ukraine gained independence from the former Soviet Union and when we thought we had moved past this stage. In a recent public lecture on the River campus, Stone argued that a Russian invasion of Ukraine would ultimately militarize NATO and render Russia less secure. Putin has often been characterized as a clever manipulator. But one has to ask, why is he making so many mistakes? Says Stone, pointing to Putin's failed attempt to poison and kill the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, which led to widespread protests in Russia and turned Navalny into a martyr and cause célèbre. Perhaps, Stone adds, what we're witnessing here is that Putin miscalculated. He hoped that the West would make concessions, and now he has to figure out how to extricate himself from a looming crisis. Does he fold or does he escalate? Q&A with Randall Stone looking at this conflict in historical context. Why do Putin's threats of invasion seem so surprising? Nations that are economically and culturally interdependent have a strong incentive toward cooperation. With the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we came to expect that a more hopeful scenario of international development would prevail. It's rational for countries that depend on each other for trade, finance, and cultural exchange to move toward cooperation, and the expectation was that international organizations would facilitate solutions to international conflict. It seemed to be the case that naked aggression just didn't pay anymore and conquering territory didn't make economic sense. Trading is much more efficient, and seizing assets didn't seem to be a strategy with a future. So, have we been mistaken? Does Putin understand something about international relations that specialists who have studied it for decades have missed? Or is this a desperate gambit that will reveal that there really isn't any way for him to exert his will in this way? How does the average Russian see Ukraine vis-à-vis Russian statehood? Russians have considered Ukraine an essential part of their territory since its 18th century annexation. Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire when Catherine the Great conquered it in the second half of the 18th century, making it an important part of the Russian myth of statehood. In the following years, an influx of Russians settled in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, and Russia came to consider Ukraine an integral and essential part of its territory. Most Russians do not regret the end of communism. Yet the average Russian would agree with Vladimir Putin that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a great tragedy. The territorial breakup of the Russian Empire is still something that is deeply troubling to most Russians. In 2014, Putin boosted his ratings when he seized Crimea and incorporated it into the Russian Federation. It is important to keep in mind that this was a very popular and virtually uncontroversial move in Russia. Why do average Russians object to the possibility of Ukraine's joining NATO? Russians consider Ukraine's joining NATO a threat to their national interest. The Russians have been telling us for a very long time that they care very deeply about this issue and that it would be a fundamental threat to Russian national interests if Ukraine joined NATO. Ironically, One of the reasons why Ukraine is not a member of NATO now is that the NATO partners have been afraid to bring such an unreliable and politically unstable country into the alliance. Who knows who is going to win the next Ukrainian election and what NATO would then be committed to? What's the historic